Uh, Thank you, Toda Rabba. It's nice to see you again. This will be, we're getting close to the end of the Shabbat studies. And last week we spoke about, we did sort of um, payback for something I owed you a few weeks ago when we did a whole series of about the way that Shabbat goes, and we said that this is the positive side of Shabbat. Most of the classes were about what is not allowed to do on Shabbat, and our meetings, two of them were about a month and a half ago, and another one was last week, was about how Shabbat is actually what is the usual things that we do on Shabbat. What does it mean to keep Shabbat? Basically, that was the question, right? We know what does it mean to prevent ourselves from doing on Shabbat, but we wanted to know also what should we do on Shabbat? What are the things that we're not only allowed to do on Shabbat, but that shape what Shabbat is? Today, we will learn something that is in a way connected to it, which is the whole issue of, I would say, the spirit of Shabbat in Shabbat. And it's called in Hebrew, issues that are connected to Uvdin Dchol, actions of weekdays. And this is a tricky subject. We will get into it, but I'll just say as a little introduction that it's a tricky subject, because when we touch upon what is Shabbat, then we're trying to understand, first of all, okay, what is not allowed to do on Shabbat? Okay, we have many different things that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. You went through them in this course. Now we have many things that we are supposed to do on Shabbat. But what about the things in the middle? The things that, or I would put it that way, is everything that is not specifically forbidden, is that allowed? And the general answer would be yes, right? If there's no problem with it whatsoever, then why not do it? Doesn't matter if it's Shabbat or not, right? But there are areas where it's not so clear. And those are things that our sages saw that would make us lose the spirit of Shabbat, even if they're not specifically forbidden by the 39 forbidden actions that we went through in this course. So this is the introduction for the subject called Uvdin Dchol, actions of weekdays, which is a definition of things that we have some issues with doing because of their nature. And here I'll open the sharing, and let's do it. Where do you do it? Just a second. We'll do it even bigger. Full screen mode. Yes. Okay. So Uvdin Dchol, workday activity on Shabbat. And the whole issue comes from a very special pasuk. I'm sure that you touched upon it already during the different learning sessions. And this special pasuk is not in the Torah, and basically it's not a specific things that we are ordered to do. It's more, it is in the prophet Isaiah, and it's more of a way to explain how Shabbat could be a delight. But it it goes through different categories, which bring a whole new dimension to what Shabbat is. Would anybody like to read the English translation of Isaiah?
I can read.
Yes, please.
If you restrain your foot because of Shabbat from performing your affairs on my holy day, and you call the Shabbat a delight, the holy of the Lord honored, and you honor it by not doing your wanted ways, by pursuing your affairs and not pursuing your affairs and speaking words. Then you shall delight with the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high places of the land, and I will give you to eat the heritage of Jacob, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Yes, I'm not sure it's the best translation you can find, but it's what I found. It's actually in Hebrew, those of you who know Hebrew, it's beautiful poetry. It's just a beautiful pasuk, and it's a very long pasuk because the whole first part is an if, right? If you do such and such and such and such, which is a long list of things, then you shall delight with the Lord, and you will have a great pleasure. Not on Shabbat, but generally, you'll have great pleasure with God. You'll have blessing for all of your life. So it's great poetry, and it's nothing to do with orders of what should you do or not do on Shabbat, but it sort of outlines many different things, and let's try to see what sort of things are outlined here. I listed them down in my words, but I also made the enters in the first part of the pasuk, so we can start thinking for ourselves. What would be the different ifs here, the different categories of if we do that, then we will delight with the Lord, etc. So the first thing is restrain your foot because of the Sabbath. And actually, raglecha in Hebrew is also a word that means foot, but it also is terribly close to the word hergel, things that I'm used to do, things that I do usually. So Isaiah asks us to restrain our foot, or to restrain what we are used to do on Shabbat. So it's an interesting way to put it, right? It's not do the things that you're not allowed to do, but it's something about not doing the usual things, not doing the everyday things. And he moves on with a similar phrase, performing your affairs, asot chafatzecha, which is also a double meaning, because chafatzecha, chefetz in Hebrew, is also what you're wishing to do, your desires, but it's also chefetz is an object in Hebrew. So again, doing your desires or doing your objects are both things that, wait, what are we talking about here, right? It's not, if I want to do something that is not problematic, why would that be problematic? But Isaiah brings forward this idea, try not to do the things that you are used to desire, or things that are deal with the objects that you are used to have on my holy day, on God's holy day. And then he moves on, V'karata la-Shabbat oneg, and you call the Shabbat a delight. So here again, those are things that we already touched upon in previous shiurim, right? This positive directive to do something that gives us a delight or gives us pleasure. So it's not only what you're allowed to do or what you're not allowed to do, but what gives you pleasure. And it moves on, and you honor it by not doing your wanted ways. Again, the things that we are used to do, the things that we do every day, by not pursuing your affairs and speaking words. And here the sages were a bit baffled, but what does it mean? Not speaking words. I mean, am I not allowed to talk on Shabbat at all? Do I need to be, are we turning into a monastery, to a silent monastery on Shabbat? What does that mean? Not speaking words. And they concluded that it means not talking about weekday issues, talking or thinking about things that are not dedicated to Shabbat. And then Isaiah moves on to the second pasuk, then you shall delight with the Lord. So basically, I think with the context of Isaiah, he tries to say, there's one thing is to keep Shabbat, to keep strictly the Shabbat that we are ordered in our Torah, the Shabbat that we got from Sinai. But there's another dimension to Shabbat, another part to Shabbat, which is maybe not something that God required us to do, but that we won't get it without it. And we won't have the pleasure or the delight with the Lord. We will not be able to really be in the relationship with God if we don't do a little more. And that is to distinguish Shabbat, to make sure that Shabbat has its own voice, its own thoughts, its own actions, things that we won't do on Shabbat, even if they are, strictly speaking, they won't have a specific thing that is forbidden. Before we move on, I wanted to ask you very shortly, what does that part do to you? How do you see this issue of making Shabbat a holy day, or making Shabbat a special day, as opposed to the things that are allowed or not allowed to do on Shabbat?
I have a very close experience, actually, this Shabbaton at the in Malmö, when we sit some people in together. It's very like automatically begin to speak. What do you do on your work? What do you do? And you want to know about the work, and you all have to remind yourself that, okay, this is not the time to speak about work. So what shall we talk about then? If we're not going to talk about work, we can. So that's actually limits the usual, go in the old tracks, do the same weekday things that you do at other. So that was that's one of the meanings.
So we will touch upon it because it's very interesting what you're saying, and the sages realize that this is something that we need to think about. In other words, if these restrictions, which are surely not something that we found in the Torah, would be too strict, then we will lose the Oneg Shabbat. Right? And so we will see when we talk about what you're not allowed to talk and what you should talk about on Shabbat, that if it's something that stops you from the specific pleasure of Shabbat, if if you are sitting around a table and you have nothing to talk about with the people around you, I'm not saying that that's what you had, your experience, but if that happens, then this is not good either, right? So these directives shouldn't be too strict, because then we're losing again the spirit of Shabbat. So thank you. And exactly that's where I wanted to go a little bit, to feel this issue and see what it contains. Does anybody else have any impressions or any thoughts? I see Michael has.
Yes, I think that it's something good, that it will help us to enjoy the Shabbat. It's not only about rules. That this is the different between just keeping the rules and make it something nice that you can enjoy.
Yes, so you're saying rules are one thing, and then how do we keep it nice? How do we keep it, you know, in Jewish Yiddish phrases, it would be, what is Shabbosdik? You heard this phrase. What is Shabbosdik? What is something that is you know, appropriate to do on Shabbat? Yes, thank you, Michael. Gisa, Sarah, what are you saying?
Well, I see it in a bit different way. I think it's, for me at least, it's much more about connection to Hashem. I would say it's like a way of learning to connect to, not only honoring, but also to connect to Hashem. That's how I would say it. Not about rules, not about what I'm supposed to do and not do, but how I'm supposed to live it, not only enjoy, but how I'm supposed to live it, how I'm supposed to get the meaning of it in full version. That's how I would say it.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that there's something very basic about this, like that the rules and the regulations are somewhat like the package, the outside of what Shabbat is. And this subject is, in a way, the thing itself, the connection to Hashem.
Yeah, because I think the rules, they are rules, okay, we all know, we all know it. But later, when we have been following these rules for so long time, are we still focusing on rules, or we're supposed to learn the meaning of it and the connection of it? Because that's what Shabbat is for. It's for the connection to Hashem. So that's my point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to point out that really here in these psukim, the mentioning of Kol Shabbat delight and honoring it is already something that we spoke about. This is, if we're going by the interpretation of the sages and the generations after that, this is exactly praying on Shabbat, having the meals, learning Torah, resting, all those things that we spoke about in previous shiurim. Here, it's something more delicate, which it would be interesting to see, Gisa Sarah, when we get into it a little more, if you think those things are also connected to the relationship between God and us, or is it something that is, in a way, a little more technical? Where do we put the line of things that are allowed on Shabbat but are not a mitzvah, or not a special pure connection to God, and the things that, even though they're not specifically or explicitly forbidden, are still not Shabbosdik? Any other thoughts or any other feelings about this whole issue that we raised now?
One small thing is that if, for example, a person who is a psychologist, he or she is very interested in his subject and speaks about deep stuff all the days, and then it's Shabbat, and we sit at the table and we discuss things that is not like not feels like work. It really feels like getting into something really interesting, but it's, in my brain, it's no border between what is interesting in the weekdays because that's a kind of job and her job, or it's just two people talking about something really interesting. Do you think that the Shabbat, since Shabbat has its own like feeling, could you go backward reversing and say that means also that the weekdays must be not so not so interesting, that they must be a little bit more like working for money or doing stuff just because you must, and so you can create the difference on the other, or is it allowed to have Shabbat all the week, all the time? That's what I want to know, because if something is really interesting, then it's a little bit dissolves what is work, what is daily things.
So I think your question leads me to bring up this issue even in a more extreme manner. The idea of Uvdin Dchol is, in a way, at least in a language of a posek, of saying what the halacha is, a rabbi who would say what the halacha is, a very weak, I'm saying EA, a very not strong claim. Because if we're talking about a rabbi who sits and tries to think what is allowed and what is not allowed, and then he said, well, I couldn't find anything that is problematic formally with what you do, but let's say it's not Shabbistic, it's a weekday thing to do, it's very weak. And we see in many responsa where one rabbi wants to say about a certain issue that it's forbidden because of Uvdin Dchol, because this is a weekday activity. And then a rabbi or another rabbi answers him and says, well, we also sleep on the weekday, so maybe sleeping is a weekday activity, and we're also eating on weekdays, so maybe eating is a weekday activity. You can't go too far with this. And so, if you're a psychologist and you speak about psychology on Shabbat, it could be just that you're speaking on an issue on Shabbat. That's fine. You're not allowed. You don't have to be silent on Shabbat, right? So I would say the opposite. It's not that you're not allowed to have Shabbat. That if you have Shabbat all the weekdays or not. It's a question of what defines something that is purely unshabbistic. It's not only that you do it on the weekdays, but that it's somehow contradicting to doing it on Shabbat. So you shared before your feeling that when you are eating with friends and they're starting to speak on their work, you feel there's something not Shabbistic about it, something of the flavor of the weekday there. But it could be also personal, and it could be also that there's a few of delicate borderlines that are hard to define, right? So this is basically the little journey that we will go through in the next half an hour, to try and define it and try to understand where are we going with this. Here. Okay, so I just wanted here, I hope I'm not going too deep here, but let's go through it. I know this is a practical lesson, so we shouldn't go too much over theory, but I just wanted to share with you here. I listed again the things that our sages understood practically from the Psukim in Isaiah: restraining from forbidden action, performing weekday affairs, calling Shabbat a delight and honoring the Shabbat, doing wanton or not doing wanton things, not surrendering to weekday needs and desires, and talking about or not talking about weekday issues. So the two yellow categories are categories that we spoke about already: not doing forbidden action and honoring the Shabbat, calling the Shabbat a delight, all the positive areas of Shabbat. Now, the four other categories are exactly borderline categories. What does it mean performing weekday affairs? What would be considered weekday affairs, even if it's not forbidden? What is a wanted thing that we are doing usually on a weekday and we shouldn't do on Shabbat? What does it mean weekday needs and desires? And what exactly is forbidden talking about? So I think the two basic explanations, or the classic rivals, the Rambam and the Ramban, the Maimonides and Nachmanides, they sort of bring two ways of looking at that issue, and we will see that in the end we take from both of them. We are seeing we didn't decide exactly what definition we prefer most, and we judge every subject by common sense. And that's why also in this issue there could be many arguments between rabbis. Many of those issues are issues that are not 100% resolved yet between the rabbis. Some are, but some are not, and we will go over a few of them. The Rambam says that this idea that Isaiah presents is basically a way to prevent us from getting to the end of what is explicitly forbidden. Don't do things that could bring you to perform a forbidden action. And so if I'm doing my wanted things, if I'm doing things that I'm used to, the things that I'm used to do, I might drag myself into doing things that are not only not Shabbos-dik, but actually forbidden. So this is one way to look at it. And the Rambam in this way is very practical. He says, yes, things that are just weekday activities that are not going to lead me to do problematic things, I will not say they are problematic even on Shabbat. But things that would be that are apt to lead me to do problematic things, I will not allow to do them on Shabbat. The Ramban says differently. The Ramban says, I'm sorry, just 1 second. I'll help my daughter here. Give me a few seconds here. I apologize for this. We were in a bit of a conflict of plans this morning.
It's okay.
So those two opinions of the Rambam and the Ramban are in a way what would lead us through different issues here. And here I stated a few, or maybe it's a good summary of most of the things that we deal with when we talk about performing weekday activities. So, buying and selling things. There's a question that came up about 500 years ago. If we are going to the store to sell things to non-Jews, is that okay? Or if we're going to sell things without money, if we decide that we're or buying things without money. If I go to the owner of the store and I give him money before Shabbat, and then I'm going in Shabbat and buy and take what I bought before Shabbat, is that okay or not? And it's a big discussion. And some of the rabbis say, as long as you're not touching the money, as long as you're not doing something that is forbidden, like carrying something, if you don't have an eruv, carrying something on the street, or if you don't use actual money, then it's okay. But many people said that it's problematic, and actually the general rule is that to sell things for instance, to non-Jews is forbidden because of Uvdin Dchol, because of weekday activities. But to buy, if you've already bought it before Shabbat, and you're just taking it, as long as you're not going through problematic actions that are really forbidden, you're allowed. Lending money, doing any kind of or lending other things. I'm sorry, not money, lending other things. It was said that it would be problematic because the usual way that we're doing those things is to write down what we lend. And if we lend, even though we decide we won't write anything, we very well could get into a point where we will feel the need to write it down. So here it's an issue that goes very much with the Rambam, saying yes, maybe lending would be all right because there's no actual melacha, actual action that is forbidden, but it is very close. We're putting ourselves in a position that might get us very close to doing a forbidden action. The same thing with having a trial. If you're a judge, or marrying and divorcing, a Beit Din can't assemble on Shabbat, even though it may be that they're not doing anything that is forbidden. They're just going some house and they're sitting and they're talking. So what could be a problem with that, right? But since those are formalities. Formalities usually require writing, require having someone who puts down the memory, who puts down what was decided, and therefore we're getting into areas which are not Shabbistic. They're not things that we do on Shabbat. Those are weekday activities. Things that are purely weekday activities that Shabbat could not benefit from. It's not like eating on Shabbat. If you can start to see the essential differences, yes, eating or sleeping, or even going on a little walk. Okay, let's talk about walking right in the next point here. But have a trial, marry and divorce would be actions that are defined by something that is connected to the normal life and has nothing to do with Shabbat. And therefore, it's a pure Uvdin Dchol issue, a pure weekday affairs issue. With running and jumping and training, it's a very interesting issue. This is a question that is being asked all the time. If I want to go for the marathon and I'm training every day to run, am I allowed to run on Shabbat? Is there any problem with running on Shabbat? Yes, I'm not doing any hole in the ground. I'm not, there was a thought that if you run on the grass, then you cut the grass. It's like this is a forbidden action. So I won't run on the grass. Am I allowed to run on Shabbat? Or to jump? Yes. Train. Can I lift weights on Shabbat? There's nothing specifically wrong about it with all the melachot, all the actions that we learned about that makes this a problem. But it is not for Shabbat. It is not something that serves the holy day of Shabbat. So, on the basis of Uvdin Dchol, it is forbidden. Now, there is a little note there that if I'm running for Shabbat, let's say I'm late for the minyan and I want to make it on time, maybe I will be allowed to run on Shabbat because it's for Shabbat. So here again, it's another example of things that are not exactly clear cut. On running, there is a specific category that is called psi'a gasa, a strong step, or a step that is not a leisurely step. And it's not in the spirit of Shabbat to do it. That's already in the Talmud. We see that it's not the spirit of Shabbat to run or to jump or to have steps that are not leisurely steps. But everyone would agree that if you're running to make the minyan on time, or if you're running to help someone, or you're running because your child is running and you want to not to stop him from having a good time or a pleasure on Shabbat, then it won't be a problem to run. For most rabbis, still there are different rabbis who would say differently. And this also touches about what already we spoke about, the delicate borderline between Uvdin Dchol and Oneg Shabbat. There are things that Oneg Shabbat, the pleasure of Shabbat, the delight of Shabbat, contradicts with, in other words, if I don't do it, I hurt my Oneg Shabbat. If my Oneg Shabbat is to play basketball, would basketball be okay or not? When we are obligated to do things that give me pleasure on Shabbat, and there are things that I can do on Shabbat which I can't do on the normal weekdays because I don't have time. So of course I can't get up on a train and go somewhere because I'm breaking Shabbat in many different ways. But would we go far to say that we're not allowed to play basketball or football or to play catch? And here again, it's complicated. This is not a clear cut. There would be many rabbis, many rabbis. I think most rabbis would say that basketball is not a Shabbat thing to do. You shouldn't jump like this and run like this, even though it gives you pleasure. Things that are not as clearly non-Shabbistic, for instance, if you do some kind of a race or some kind of a game that requires running, and it's for a group of people and they're having a great, huge fun, and it's a social focus, then it would be more okay, even for those rabbis. There will be other rabbis who would say that they don't see any problem with playing basketball, since yes, it's part of the pleasure of Shabbat. If we find time to play basketball on Shabbat, and it doesn't ruin any law, any specific law, then there would be no problem with that. Bike riding is an even more extreme example. I think no rabbi would allow bike riding, even not for synagogue, even not for shul. But if you think about it, essentially, once, as long as it's not an electric bike, what exactly would be the problem? If you drive in the area where it's allowed to drive, when you're not going around outside of the tchum, outside of 2,000 amma, and if you are not, if you have an eruv, and yeah, what would be the problem if there's no electricity? And so actually with bike riding, it's interesting because there were a few ways to say that it would be problematic. One way was to say that, which is a famous example from riding a horse, that the Talmud says you're not allowed to ride a horse because you might want to cut a branch and use it as a whip. So you will ride a horse and all of a sudden you will see that you don't have a whip. So you won't refrain yourself. You will think, you will be so concentrated on riding that you will cut the branch and use it as a whip. So from that, the rabbis learned that when you get yourself into a situation where you are using something that is easily broken, you would have such a huge urge to fix it that it's better not to use it at all. So that was one way to exclude bike riding or any kind of riding that is not explicitly forbidden. But most rabbis said that it's just not Shabbistic. It's Uvdin Dchol. It's weekday activities. Another interesting kind of activity is measuring. Measuring is not an activity that causes any, even it's not breaking oneg Shabbat, right? It's not a hard job to measure things. It could be a very, very simple thing to measure things. Yeah, I could take, a little meter and measure. It's interesting, but all of our rabbis say in a very strong voice that measuring is Uvdin Dchol. It may be allowed by the explicit rules, but it's not Shabbistic. It's not something that we need to know on Shabbat. We can use things without measuring them. Measuring is a weekday thing to do. To me, it's a little example, but a very big example in the sense that it teaches me what it's about, right? Like, why would anybody care about measuring? But no, it is a explicitly weekday thing to do. So you're not allowed to do it, even though it's very, very small and almost no effort, but it's not something that you do. Yes, Monica and Kato.
I think I can understand the measuring, because when you measure something, it's because you maybe want to make something. You don't go around and measure something for pleasure. But I still can get around this bike riding. You will never use a whip on your bike. It's just something you do to get into the nature, for example.
Yes, so I think that here it's really the big question. That's why I put it forward fairly early. Yes, you go to nature, and you're having a pleasure of Shabbat, but it's something that is not Shabbat, a Shabbat thing to do. It's something that you would do on a normal weekday. Maybe your question leads me to try and define a little more what would it mean to do things that are not Shabbistic. So from the Pasuk of Isaiah, right? It's all based on the Pasuk of Isaiah. All of this issue is based on the Pasuk of Isaiah. And in the Pasuk of Isaiah, what we are called upon is to dedicate ourselves to what happens on Shabbat and to the things that would the things that would strengthen our Shabbat experience. And in a way, what the rabbis say is that going to nature is a beautiful thing, very positive thing. There are many positive things that we do on a weekday. But when you look at the way that Shabbat was structured, going out to nature has nothing to do with it. It's a pleasurable thing. It's a good thing to do, but it has nothing to do with the basic idea of what Shabbat is. Going out to nature, actually, it's very interesting because one of the first rules of Shabbat that the people of Israel got, and we will read it in 3 weeks in the Parashat Shavua, is don't get out of your house on Shabbat. And that's where all the issue of Tchumin and of the Eruv and all of that came from. You're supposed to stay in your house. It's a house activity on Shabbat. And so even though it's very, very positive, it would lead us, riding on a bike would lead us to those things. Now, you would say, okay, so now you should forbid also walking to nature on Shabbat, right? And the answer is that we won't go that far. If you have pleasure from walking around on Shabbat, then you're close to nature and you're not breaking any rule by going too far or going with something in your pockets, or we won't forbid you to walk. But going on a bike would be one step further. And again, I agree with you that it is vague. It is vague. And this example shows why most rabbis, if they want to really forbid something, they will not use Uvdin Dchol. They will not use this issue because it's a weak issue. It's something that is connected to the feeling more than real facts. Rebecca Ktura and then Monica, and then we will have to move on because we're getting close to the end of the class.
But also, in most community, at least here in the community in Oslo, there's no eruv, so riding a bike would be problematic anyway, because at some point you would need to get off, you would need to push it, you would need to carry it. You still have, even families with small children don't push their children around in prams on Shabbat, they stay at home. So, there's a lot of things to think about in general when you don't have an eruv.
Yeah, thank you for saying that again. It was important for me to say it right in the beginning, and you're right. It's in a place that there's no eruv. It's anyway theoretical, all of that. Yes, Monica.
But I think in the Nordic country, we tend to stay inside our house actually too much. Sometimes the only days that you actually get out is Shabbat. You're not working. The other days we are at work, and then we go home and stay inside because it's cold or whatever, or we're tired. So if you want to do opposite what we normally do, we should get out of the house.
That's a nice claim. It's a nice claim, and it would be a nice example of what modern days do to our religious affairs. Theoretically, I agree with you, and it would be something that would be interesting to examine. You're giving me here food for thought. Thank you. Yes, Justin.
Maybe a bit out of the topic of writing, but I know we are not allowed to play musical instrument, but I don't remember why. Is it because it's weekday pleasure, or is it work?
So here again, yes, it's very much like riding the bike, because most rabbis who really want to say it's problematic won't say that it's Uvdin Dchol, because then it's weak. It's not a strong claim. The usual reason is, again, because I might want to fix it if it goes out of tune, or if something breaks, I would want to fix it, and that's why it's forbidden. In terms of playing, there's a whole other issue of chukot hagoyim, of the ways that the non-Jews, or mostly the Christians, are performing their religious commandments. And since the organ and music is so strong in Christian communities, and we're talking about a time when rabbis were very afraid that more and more Jews are being exposed to Christianity and are getting interested in Christianity. They made a point to say that it's a very, very serious thing to play on Shabbat. So there will be a huge gap there. So this is an example of an issue. I don't know if you touched upon it, about halacha that comes from the realpolitik of certain generations. Let's move on. Another interesting example, just a second. Another interesting example is going to see the working place or a building that we are building. If we are in the middle of building a house and we want to go and see how the building is going on, and as Monica said, all week we are at work, and now is a perfect opportunity to go and see how the building is going. We're not allowed to. It's Uvdin Dchol. Yeah, think about the building of the house on the weekday, not on Shabbat. Presents, it's a big issue. And there are many that hold that it's a problem to get presents on Shabbat. And so if you are used to be hosted somewhere, I think here in the diaspora, it's less common because of the issue of Eruv, that you're not allowed to carry anything on Shabbat. But in Israel, almost any Shabbat meal you go, you bring with you something for the family. And many people bring presents, and it's a problem to get presents on Shabbat because of Uvdin Dchol. The underlining here is that if it's something that you can use on Shabbat, it's not only permissible, it's nice. And therefore you will see many guests who will bring wine bottles or some kind of nice something to eat, because of course eating is a pleasurable thing that is good to do on Shabbat. So presents that we can use on Shabbat are better. Of course, there's an issue there with packaging, because you're not allowed to tear in a certain way. There's, if you bring a present, make sure it's not packaged, and if it is packaged, there's a way to do it right, but we won't get into it. Packaging is a problem, but the very essence of a present, as long as it's something that is allowed on Shabbat, or that is a mitzvah on Shabbat, it's allowed to bring as a present. And if it's not something that you can use on Shabbat, even if it's not muktzeh or something that is not allowed to hold on Shabbat, still it will be problematic because of Uvdin Dchol. Okay, the last part of the pasuk was vedaber davar, talking about things, and the rabbis understood it, talking about things that are not allowed to talk about on Shabbat. And here I'm giving a few examples of that also. Planning business is not allowed, even though it's just talking, but it's talking about things that are not Shabbat. And if anybody would want to stay after the class, I would tell you a joke about that. The same as closing a deal, even not talking business, but closing some kind of a deal is not permissible on Shabbat. Reading bills, or any kind of reading material that is not Shabbat, there's a big discussion about it. There were rabbis, I think most generations, most rabbis said that you're not allowed to read anything that is not holy on Shabbat. You should read only Torah things. So that means also not the newspaper and not adventure books. Nowadays, I think the rabbis are more. They prefer to consider it as Oneg Shabbat as long as it's not something unholy. It's a nice time to read things, and this is what I do also. I read also the news, and I read also any kind of books. But I'm sensitive here. For instance, I won't read politics on Shabbat. I won't read things that are business-like. I will try to stay within the confines of what gives me pleasure. You're probably familiar with the famous Fiddler on the Roof quote. Why can't you give us some happy news? You know that? Never mind. I'll move on. Games, different games to play, board games. In previous generations, they were considered a very, very big Chilul Shabbat, breaking of the Shabbat. If you're playing Monopoly or playing other board games, it would be really problematic. I think nowadays rabbis lean more towards saying it is Oneg Shabbat, and therefore it's fine to play different board games. There will be rabbis who would be in the middle, who would say that board games like Monopoly or like other board games that really involve money, even if it's game money, would be problematic. Would be problematic to do because it's too much similar to business. And a very, very important thing that would lead us also to the last category, asking someone to do something after Shabbat. If I meet a friend of mine and I'm telling him, "Oh, you are good with building. Let's talk. Let's if you can come to me on Motzei Shabbat and build me a closet or help me with a shelf or things like that," this is problematic. It's going out of the Shabbat context, and therefore it's forbidden to talk about things to do after Shabbat. And this leads us, okay, it's 10:30. Formally, we finished the material that we were supposed to learn about this subject. I wanted to add another category of things that are considered preparation from Shabbat to after Shabbat. And Rabbi Moshe David told me that there wasn't a plan to talk about it. So I thought it's a good opportunity, but please, anybody who wants to leave, it's a Sunday and it's a morning, and feel free to leave. And whoever wants to stay and listen to this last category is invited to stay. Preparing from Shabbat to after Shabbat. So this is not included in Isaiah. This is something that is even more. It's later. It's something that is going in a way deeper into once you have Shabbat and you know what's allowed and what's not allowed. The question is, can you prepare from Shabbat to after Shabbat? And the answer is no. And here it is much more clear. Until now, we spoke about things that could be vague, that are a little bit weaker in the sense of what is allowed and what is not allowed. As I said, most rabbis would not use Uvdin Dchol if it's an important issue that they want to be clear that it's not okay to do on Shabbat. Hachana mikodesh l'chol, preparing from Shabbat to after Shabbat, is more serious. It doesn't have a specific pasuk or a specific source that forbids it, but it makes a lot of sense. When you're on Shabbat, you can't do things that are for after Shabbat. And since it's serious, it's also, there are not many discussions or about it. It is what it is, and I will go through the main issues. And of course, I want to urge you, if you have questions about that, if you have things that you're not sure that you usually do, and you're not sure if it's Shabbat thing or not, if it's preparation or not, you should ask your rabbi. And it will be anyway an interesting discussion. So, washing dishes and cleaning the house. If I want to wash my dishes, but I know that I will use my dishes only after Shabbat, it could be a problem to wash dishes, because I'm not doing it for the sake of Shabbat, even though, again, it's not something that is forbidden to wash dishes on Shabbat. Since I don't have any use of them on Shabbat, it could be forbidden. The halacha here is if this an untidy kitchen or untidy sink breaks your oneg Shabbat, it's hard for you to get around the house knowing that the sink is dirty, you should wash your dishes, because it's serving the Shabbat. It serves your need for oneg Shabbat. But if all the reason for washing the dishes is so I won't have to work too hard after Shabbat, or so I could use the clean dish after Shabbat, it would be forbidden. Learning for a test is a big issue for students. Anybody here who's a student, it's a big issue. Am I allowed to learn for a test that will happen after Shabbat? The general way to deal with it, at least in modern times with modern halacha, is to say that if it's something that I'm gaining knowledge from, then I could do it also on Shabbat, because gaining knowledge is a positive thing that is allowed to do on Shabbat, and in a way it's a mitzvah also to do on Shabbat. Of course, if it's a test of a holy thing, of Torah, or I don't know what, then even better, but also just worldly things that are giving me more knowledge, it's absolutely fine. If I know this already and I just want to be sure, I want to prepare more, then I shouldn't learn on Shabbat. I should wait after Shabbat and then study. Many students are, it's a big challenge for them, and I'm telling you that also when I was a student in college, you may have a test. Well, here you will have a test not before Monday, but in Israel you can have a test also on Sunday, and then on the day before not to learn is very hard. And amongst us as college students, we always heard these things, that there is more blessing in a test that you didn't learn on Shabbat, even though you had less time to study before. I'm not guaranteeing this. I'm not a Kabbalist rabbi, so I can't say anything about the blessing. But I think this is one of the big challenges that really, in my experience, at least as a college student, as a previous college student, that defined in my feeling the dedication for Shabbat. Knowing that you have a test on Sunday, and knowing that I'll learn until Shabbat, but on Shabbat, even though I'm very stressed from the test, I will not open the books. But again, if it's something that you are still gaining knowledge from, there are many rabbis who would allow it. Going to sleep on Shabbat, again, a very interesting issue. There's a mitzvah to sleep on Shabbat. We should sleep on Shabbat. But if we are saying, I need to go to sleep on Shabbat because I have a big party on Motzei Shabbat, and I want to be wide awake for that until late at night, or I'm saying I have a big flight I need to fly tonight, so I will sleep on Shabbat, that is forbidden because it's preparation from Shabbat to the weekday. So it's very connected to what you think in your mind. What are you thinking about? There's a whole issue, which is a very serious issue of preparing for Yom Tov. If a holiday starts on Motzei Shabbat, what am I allowed to do? And what am I not allowed to do? So anything that serves the Shabbat is okay. But if I'm trying to do something that serves explicitly the holiday, the Yom Tov, it's forbidden. For instance, it doesn't happen this year, but if the Pesach Seder starts at Motzei Shabbat, you're not allowed to prepare the Seder on Shabbat. If there's a holiday meal, Rosh Hashanah and Motzei Shabbat, of course you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat, but you're not allowed also to prepare the food. Take something out of the refrigerator, taking something, making a salad that you will eat on the holiday on Motzei Shabbat. So it's a serious thing, and of course not changing clothes. And actually, it's interesting. Again, in a time that Rosh Hashanah is on Motzei Shabbat, we switch clothes. We want new clothes for the new holiday, for the new year, but we shouldn't do it before Shabbat goes out. Even though we have Shabbat clothes also on Shabbat. So it looks like the same kind of clothes, but since in my intention it is for the holiday, it's forbidden. And going on Shabbat to the workplace, saying, okay, I will go out right before Shabbat ends, so I will be on my workplace on Motzei Shabbat and start working. This would be a problem. So people who are either actors or bartenders, who want to open the place on Shabbat, on Motzei Shabbat, the second that Shabbat goes out, it could be a problem. If you have a real problem with that, ask your rabbi, because sometimes when it comes to your parnasah, to your livelihood, there will be some things that could be easier there. So all of those things, if you're not sure, ask your rabbi. Don't put too much pressure on yourself, being sure that it's not Shabbosdik enough or preparing from Shabbat to after Shabbat. Ask, don't make your life miserable if you feel it becomes a little bit miserable because of these rules. But it's important to know that these are big issues on Shabbat, and we should think about them. And I want to finish by saying that all of that is still connected to Isaiah, to say to ourselves, what is the image of Shabbat that we want? What is the spirit of Shabbat that we would like to have? And how we are making sure that what we surround ourselves on Shabbat is Shabbat things that are purely and ultimately what Shabbat has to look like. Shavua Tov, and all the best.
You
thank
promised
you
us a joke.
Oh, you want the joke?
I
Okay.
want the joke.
Okay, so the joke goes like this: that in Yiddish, there's a sentence which has become a trick, not talking about Shabbosdik things. So Jews used to say, "Nicht auf Shabbos geredet." In other words, I'm not talking about Shabbos, but I will, and now I will talk about Shabbos. Since I said about the weekday, sorry, since I said I'm not talking about weekdays, so now I will talk about the weekdays. And so there's a joke of two Jews in the synagogue, and one says, "Nicht auf Shabbos gered." I heard you're selling your car. And he says, "Nicht auf Shabbos gered," right? So the first one says, "Nicht auf Shabbos gered," for how much? So this other guy says, "Nicht auf Shabbos gered," for 1,000,000 apples, because then you're allowed to talk about, it's not money, it's apples, right? So not a million. I'm exaggerating, but so the first guy says, okay, Nisha Shabbos Geret, let me think about it. And so the prayer moves on, and then somewhere after Torah laning, the first guy comes to the second guy saying, Nisha Shabbos Geret, let's do it. I want the car. So the second guy says, Nisha Shabbos Geret, it's already sold. So that's the joke. Shavua Tov, all the best. If anybody has any other questions, I'm here for a few more minutes. And
is it possible to? I think it's not possible to build your own eruv around your house.
do your own eruv.
Yes.
No, eruv is a terribly difficult thing, and it involves also the agreement of the people who are in the eruv. So it's a terribly difficult thing. So it has to be something that comes from the community, and that the community does with the municipality or with it's no. In other words, you can't. You should discuss this with your rabbi.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, Gisa Sarah.
Yes, I don't know. Maybe this would be for another class, but I get very curious. Why aren't we allowed to listen? Not to listen. How would I say? We're supposed to read Torah. We are allowed, yes, but there are some things also related to Judaism that we are not allowed to. Is that right?
Not allowed to read?
Not every single thing. And there were also something, I forgot now the name of it, but we are not allowed to every single thing. But I guess this might go to another class. It's something related more.
No, actually, I mentioned it that in previous generations, the way that the rabbis decided was that there will be very limited things that you are allowed to read on Shabbat, only holy things. And you're right that there were also fine-tuning there. What exactly? Nowadays, and the way that I go is that if it gives you a pleasure, most of the things you will be allowed to read, even things that are not connected to Torah at all. If it gives you a pleasure of Shabbat, that is okay, in my eyes.
What would you say, for example, about Talmud?
Talmud, it's a mitzvah to learn. Talmud, nobody thinks it's a problem.
I know, on Shabbos.
Yeah. On Shabbos, it's a mitzvah to learn on Shabbos.
Okay.
Anything that is purely holy is a mitzvah to learn. It's not even a question.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, so Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh.
תודה רבה, שבוע טוב, חודש טוב.
חודש טוב. תודה רבה, שבוע טוב. תודה רבה, שבוע טוב. תודה.
Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. Bye.